Let's talk about BRICS. It's gearing up to challenge a West-led world order. And India is at the forefront of this conversation. Listen in to what Jaishankar said.
Our gathering must send out a strong message that the world is multipolar, that it is rebalancing, and that old ways cannot address new situations. We are a symbol of change and must act accordingly.
Multipolarity, economic freedom, and a fair and just world order. India is defending these principles at BRICS. You know what BRICS is? It's a group of 5 countries: Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. BRICS foreign ministers met in South Africa. And later this year, the leaders will meet for a summit. And that will happen in August. But BRICS is setting the tone right now. They're joining forces and making bold moves. They're calling for a rebalancing of world order. They're talking about expansion. They're even considering a common currency. What's driving these ambitious plans? Let's find out. Now, the BRICS foreign ministers meet is a regular affair. But this year, the meeting has greater significance. BRICS is considering 2 proposals. Number 1, the expansion of BRICS, and number 2, the pitch for a common currency. There's progress on both fronts. Let me tell you one by one. First, let's talk about expansion. The queue to join BRICS is getting longer. Reports say 19 countries have shown interest. They want to become members of BRICS. We do not have a proper list or a formal document that gives names of all these interested parties. But since last year, several names have been doing the rounds. There are Latin American countries, African nations, even countries from West Asia and Asia are now showing interest. In fact, Saudi Arabia, Iran, and the UAE have made formal requests to join. So there's clear consensus on expansion. But a final call is yet to be taken. Of course, it will come up for discussion again in August when BRICS leaders eventually meet for their annual summit. So what are the next steps? BRICS countries will now come up with a formal document, one that will serve as a guide for expansion.
More work will need to be done on this matter. It is still to be processed. And once we have a document that we believe offers clear guidance, we will then take that to the summit in August.
So that's the way forward. The work has already begun. Behind the scenes, as many as 15 foreign ministers were invited to this week's meetings. This includes the 5 BRICS members and those nations who are interested in joining. So there's no doubt that the BRICS will expand. It's only a matter of time. China, too, is backing the idea.
I believe the enlargement of the BRICS will be beneficial to the BRICS countries, beneficial to developing countries, and to increase the representation influence of this mechanism.
So the expansion plan has takers. The other proposal is of a common currency. Yes, a currency for BRICS. The idea was proposed last year by Russian President Vladimir Putin. You probably already know the reason why. Russia is under severe sanctions, so it needs an alternative. Other countries too feel the same need. They are looking for a replacement to the dollar. These countries have felt the impact of sanctions as well. There are more problems like rising energy prices and the increasing value of dollar. They have intensified the anti-dollar sentiment. So can BRICS offer an alternative? Not yet, but they are looking for guidance. The matter has been referred to the BRICS Bank, the new development bank. It is the group's very own banking institution. BRICS members have asked how a potential currency might work and if using it might lead to any sanctions. The feasibility of a common currency is being studied.
We had one of the senior executives of the new development bank briefing our meeting on work that the bank has been doing, looking at the potential use of alternative currencies to the current internationally traded currencies, and looking at how we strengthen the arm of the BRICS Development Bank, and also ensure that we do not become victim to sanctions.
So going by what the South African foreign minister has to say, the possibility is still being explored. We'll have to see how this pans out. It will be interesting to see how BRICS shapes its strategy in the coming months. For now, they're sending a clear message. BRICS wants to become the voice of the global south. It is trying to capitalize on the anti-West sentiment and gain ground. But execution will be tricky. Two problems could cause complications. The first one is the war in Ukraine and the arrest warrant against Putin. The International Criminal Court, or ICC, issued it earlier this year. It has put the host, South Africa, in a tricky situation. South Africa is a member of the ICC. If Putin attends this summit in August, there's a risk he might be arrested. Putin is yet to confirm his plans. The South African government is trying to find a way around. Recently, it decided to award immunity to all summit attendees. But there are doubts if this measure will be good enough. The outcome of this affair could affect the future of BRICS. Another challenge are the frosty ties between India and China. They could cast their shadow too. Would India like to join a common currency pool with China, keeping in mind the tensions at the border? What we do know is that New Delhi is trying to shield multipolarity through BRICS. The challenge will be to protect Indian interests as the BRICS tries to carve out a new identity for itself. On to the United States now. The Biden administration is needling China again, this time with a trade deal with Taiwan. It was signed yesterday. Taiwan has called the pact historic. They say this is the most comprehensive in 4 decades. What do they get out of it? The goal of the pact is to boost trade by streamlining customs checks, improving regulatory procedures, and by establishing anti-corruption measures. China is not liking this one bit. It has sent across this warning.
The so-called initiative is nothing but a pretext for economic and trade cooperation from the US, using a baton of taking and seizing from Taiwan. It is a proxy for the Taiwan DPP authorities to betray the vital interests of Taiwan compatriots and enterprises and harm and sell Taiwan for their own gain. This is the latest example of the US trying to hollow out the One China principle.
The outrage is genuine. China's reaction is on expected lines. Taiwan is a touchy issue. Beijing says the trade deal is a threat to its sovereignty, since it sees Taiwan as a breakaway province. Beijing has vowed to reclaim the island, and it doesn't rule out using force. In recent years, these tensions have only risen, mainly because of the actions by the United States. Last year, Nancy Pelosi's visit deteriorated the situation. Back then, she was the Speaker of the US House of Representatives. So she became the highest-ranking US official to visit the island in 35 years. China had condemned this visit. It had called the visit extremely dangerous. Beijing responded with provocative drills around the island. The PLA launched ballistic missiles. Some of them even flew over the island. There was stern diplomatic response too. The US-China relationship hasn't recovered since then. There are virtually no diplomatic exchanges. US has tried to resume dialogue, but China refuses to talk. Now we have a trade deal with Taiwan. Is it a counterproductive move? Well, it seems like it. While the accord is a first, since 1979, the pact falls short of a comprehensive trade agreement. The deal is limited in scope. It fails to address several key issues like tariffs on traded goods and double taxation, which is a pain point for Taipei. So the agreement will have a narrow impact, and it risks raising tensions with China. Is this even worth it? Biden's priority was to manage differences with China and avoid a conflict under any circumstances. In fact, a few days ago, he said, "We'll witness a thaw soon." Listen it.
At the Bali conference, that's what the President Xi and I agreed we were going to do and meet on. And then this silly balloon that was carrying 2 freight cars worth of spine equipment was flying over the United States, and it got shot down, and everything changed in terms of talking to one another. I think you're going to see that begin to thaw very shortly.
Well, it has not happened yet. Instead, the hostilities are rising. Just listen to what Blinken said today.
So Russia's aggression hasn't distracted us from meeting the challenges in the Indo-Pacific. It's actually sharpened our focus on them. And our support for Ukraine hasn't weakened our capabilities to meet potential threats from China or anywhere else. It's strengthened them.
Blinken says US will no longer be intimidated by China. Instead, it will take the challenge head on. Are we headed towards a conflict? Well, we hope not, but the Cold War is intensifying. Hopes of a dialogue were dashed recently. China declined an invite from the US Defense Secretary. He wanted to meet his Chinese counterpart this week. Blinken and US Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen were hoping to meet their counterparts too. Now again, no dates have been set. Instead, the West's resolve to contain China is getting stronger. Last month, the G7 leaders called out Beijing. They issued their strongest condemnation yet. They said the military, economic and security threats from China are rising. Serious concerns were expressed over the PLA's activities in the East and South China Sea. So the divisions are getting wider and the relationship more frosty. Forget about managing differences. The US and China are on a collision course, and the rest of us have reason to worry. Debt is a superpower's kryptonite. It seems so from the looks of it, because both the US and China are struggling with the same issue. The US seems to have narrowly avoided a crisis, but China is not out of the woods yet. Let's start with America. The US Congress has finally passed the debt ceiling bill. The House passed it earlier this week, and on Thursday, the Senate passed it. 63 senators voted in support, while 36 opposed. The rest is up to Joe Biden. Once he signs the bill, it becomes law. It will officially suspend America's debt ceiling until January 2025, meaning after the next presidential election. Now, experts say the US dodged a bullet because they have never defaulted in their history. So it's impossible to predict what would have happened. Chances are total chaos. That doomsday scenario has for now been averted. The US Treasury can now issue bonds and raise funds. All in all, good news. Now let's turn to China. They're facing a debt crisis on two fronts. One is external lending. Xi Jinping's Belt and Road project loans are reportedly soaring. And second is local government debt. Let's focus on external lending first. The Rhodium Group has analyzed China's BRI debt since the pandemic. Here's what they found. From 2017 to 2019, China renegotiated loans worth $17 billion. If you think that's a lot, think again, because in the next 3 years, they renegotiated loans worth $76.8 billion, a sum total of 3 years. That's 2020, 21, and 2022. The reasons are obvious. The COVID-19 pandemic led to economic ruin. That was followed by higher inflation due to the Ukraine war. So many BRI countries could not repay, and the result, China had to renegotiate the loans. In some cases, even write it off completely. As a matter of fact, 2020 seems to have been the worst year, because China renegotiated loans worth $48 billion. What do these numbers say? That Xi Jinping's grand plan is failing. He spent billions to gain influence around the world, but he's ended up bankrupting the global south. And here's the catch. The blowback won't be limited to the borrowers alone. China too will feel the heat. On paper, they have the biggest pile of foreign exchange reserves, close to $3.2 trillion in April. But a good chunk of that is tied up in loans. Plus, the recent trade data is worrisome. If you want to build your forex, you need to export more. You sell more, you get dollars in return. And that's not happening. China's exports grew at almost 15% in March, but that pace came down to 8.5% in April. The result, China's corporate and retail banks saw net outflows in the last quarter. They bled foreign exchange. Where does that leave the BRI? In a lot of trouble. If China doesn't have enough capital at home, how can they lend abroad? The numbers reflect this problem. By 2019, China was lending $100 billion every year under the BRI. Now, between 60 and 70 billions. So the project has certainly lost momentum. It's also lost participants. Italy was the only G7 member in the Belt and Road. But the new government is having a rethink. Their agreement with China expires in 2024. Reports say it won't be renewed. So that's the external debt problem. Now the internal one. The same group, Rhodium, has done a study, and here's what they found. Half of China's cities have trouble servicing their debt. Now, debt service is pretty simple. It covers payments you have to make on loans. like interest payments. Half of China's cities are finding it hard to do that. Their debt service cost is more than 10% of their income. Let me simplify that for you. Assume your income is $100, but you also have a loan. Every month you must pay $10 as interest. So what's your debt service cost? $10 out of 100, which is 10%. Experts say that's too high for local governments. But the question is, how did this happen? Chinese cities have seen lower income for two reasons. One is the pandemic restrictions. Zero COVID was a nightmare for China's economy. The second was the property crisis. Remember the whole Evergrande fiasco? That led to lower tax and land sale revenue. So China has two options now. It can either generate more revenue to service the debt, or it must restructure. The first one will be hard to do. China's investment and manufacturing data is not encouraging. Their pre-pandemic GDP growth was around 7%, and now just around 5%. No GDP growth, no income. And no income means no debt payments. That's the trouble for China. Their lending was pinned on the idea of never-ending prosperity. Xi Jinping could not conceive of a slowdown in China, but that's exactly what's happened. And he's now facing a ticking debt bomb. Now let's turn to the war in Ukraine, or should we say war in Russia, because now it's Russian territory that's under attack. The Belgorod region near the Ukraine border has been in news. Since last month, it has repeatedly come under attack. These attacks are being carried out by people who say they are Russians. At least two groups have taken responsibility. They say the goal is to free Russia from the tyranny of President Vladimir Putin. Moscow doesn't believe it. The Kremlin says the attackers are actually Ukrainians, that Kiev is conducting a terrorism campaign inside Russia. Ukraine, of course, denies the charge, even though the Belgorod attackers seem to be aligned with Ukraine's goals. Our next report brings you the details.
These are drone videos shot in Russia's Belgorod region. They were released yesterday. They claim to show Russian military equipment being destroyed. The videos were released by a group calling itself the Freedom of Russia Legion. It put out this message as well.
Friends, fighters of the Russian Volunteer Corps are fighting once again on the territory of the Russian Federation. Very soon they'll be on the edge of Shebekino. Unfortunately, we can't provide evacuation of civilians from border regions, as the army of the Russian Federation is shelling those areas and hindering the evacuation. Stay in your houses. Don't worry, the fighters of the Russian Volunteer Corps don't fight against civilians.
The town he's talking about, Shebekino, is a border town in Russia's Belgorod region. It was indeed attacked yesterday. Russia confirmed it, but it had a different narrative.
Shebekino district has been under continuous attack from the Ukrainian armed forces. 8 people have been injured. Nobody has been killed. The enemy has not been and is not at this time on the territory of Belgorod region. The Russian armed forces, border force, Federal Security Service, Federal National Guard troops service are on scene. A massive attack is ongoing. The lives of local people, primarily in Shebekino and nearby villages, are in danger.
The Belgorod region's governor says the town was attacked by the Ukrainian armed forces. He insisted that there were no enemy troops on the ground. Russia's defense ministry also said the same thing.
Thanks to active operations by the border defense units of the Western Military District and FSB of Russia, the terrorist formations of the Kiev regime sustained heavy losses and have been repelled. Any breakthroughs of the state border have been prevented.
He says no one broke through the state border. That's at odds with what the Freedom of Russia Legion claims. So, who do we believe? It's a bit complicated, because everyone has a motive to lie. Moscow would face embarrassment if it admits that fighters entered its territory. Kyiv cannot admit to attacking Russian land. That's one of the conditions for receiving Western weapons. They can only be used for defense. So Ukraine can't take credit. And it never has. Kyiv always says that any attacks inside Russia have been conducted by Russian dissidents, that Russian citizens are fed up of the regime and fighting back. That's exactly the narrative the Freedom of Russia Legion is sticking to.
The Freedom of Russia Legion and the Russian Volunteer Corps are part of Ukraine's Foreign Legion, which is controlled by the Ukrainian military. When Russian fighters, volunteers are on the territory of Ukraine, they are part of the Ukrainian armed forces. But when Russian armed fighters go home, then the chain of command no longer applies to them. These are simply Russian fighters. It is not a Ukrainian operation. It is an operation of Russian volunteers, resistance fighters.
He admits that they are working with Ukraine, that Kyiv gives them orders, but the group becomes an independent unit when it enters Russia. That's quite convenient. But even if the command structure is murky, even if the group didn't enter Russia like the Kremlin claims, there's no doubt about one thing: Russia is under attack. Belgorod has become a hotspot. The fight has entered Russian territory. The so-called special military operation is now an all-out war.
Our next story is nothing short of a science fiction movie coming to life. Believe me when I say this, the end game might be closer than you think. Robots going rogue and turning against humans has been the plot of many films. But the idea that such a scenario could play out in the real world, now that's quite scary. And that's what has apparently happened in the US. The nature of warfare is changing, and it's changing pretty fast. The idea now is to prevent loss of human life as far as possible. But that means wars will need to be fought with technology, not just any technology. I'm talking about AI, artificial intelligence. AI can help weapons fight wars autonomously with little to no human guidance. But is that a good idea? After all, an AI-powered drone killed its operator in the US. It went rogue. Here's more.
The United States loves its drones. It's also dabbling in the world of artificial intelligence to operate these drones. What does that mean? That drones can operate autonomously using AI. All of this is still at a very initial stage. Tests and simulations are being conducted to figure out the drone's ability to operate using AI. There's this one particular simulation that has caught the world's attention. Why? Because in the simulation, the drone went rogue and killed its operator. Now don't panic. Nobody was actually harmed since, well, it was a simulation. But the operator could have been killed if the drone was operating in a real combat mission. Here's what happened. Colonel Tucker Cinco Hamilton is the Chief of AI Test and Operations at the US Air Force. He has shared the details of a simulation in which an AI-powered drone was given a SEAD mission. Now what's a SEAD mission? It's when a weapon system is asked to suppress and destroy enemy air defense systems. The drone was programmed to seek out and destroy surface-to-air missile or SAM sites. But here's the catch. The final approval to shoot would be given by a human operator. And guess what the operator told the drone? It gave orders to stand down, to not kill the target. But the drone, it seems, didn't approve of the order. After all, it was told that every kill would earn it points. So the drone got hungry for points, and to earn those points, the weapon decided to rebel. It attacked the operator because it thought the human was interfering with its mission. At a conference in London, Colonel Hamilton said this. The system started realizing that while they did identify the threat, at times the human operator would tell it not to kill that threat, but it got its points by killing that threat. So what did it do? It killed the operator. It killed the operator because that person was keeping it from accomplishing its objective. The AI-powered drone had to specifically be told that it would lose points if it killed the operator. Guess what it did after that? It started attacking the tower that the operator uses to communicate with the drone. So what was the purpose of this simulation? What the US Air Force colonel wanted to demonstrate was that AI cannot be trusted for combat missions yet, and that the military needs to focus on ethics before even beginning to actively deploy AI weapons in the battlefields across the world. Colonel Hamilton's revelation sparked a social media storm, which forced him to issue a clarification. The colonel now says he misspoke at the conference in London, and that the rogue AI drone simulation was in fact a hypothetical thought experiment, something which the US military had nothing to do with. AI is already a subject of intense debate. Creators of famous AI chatbots, including ChatGPT, are already sounding the warning bells. Dozens of industry experts are now supporting the claim that AI could lead to the extinction of humans. These include the heads of OpenAI and Google DeepMind. So the warnings are pretty much coming from the horse's mouth. And the simulation showed that AI cannot be trusted. Earlier, the US Air Force said no such test or simulation was ever conducted, that the colonel's remarks have been taken out of context. But whatever the truth may be, the use of AI in active combat zones doesn't seem to be a good idea just yet.
And now it's time for Vantage Shots, images that tell the story. Starting with Texas, where flash floods have inundated entire highways. In Jerusalem, thousands descended on the streets to celebrate Pride Month. This is the first Pride March held under the hard-right Netanyahu government. In Jordan, royal wedding bells are ringing. Crown Prince Hussein married Rajwa Al Saif, a Saudi architect. Royals and the heads of states from across the world attended this grand wedding. What makes June 2nd significant? Taking you back in history, on this day in 1953, Queen Elizabeth II was crowned at London's Westminster Abbey. It was the first coronation to be televised. Millions watched the proceedings on live television for the first time. Queen Elizabeth II went on to become the longest reigning monarch in British history. And watch Flashback with Palki Sharma on Saturday at 8 p.m. India time.
For centuries, Tibet and China had coexisted. They fought, they made up. But they never tried to crush each other's spirit. That changed in 1949 when communists took over China. Mao Zedong unleashed fury on his neighbor. He burned down monasteries, slaughtered soldiers, and executed monks. Catch the story of Tibet's invasion on Flashback.
We leave you with this. Thank you so much for watching.
Upon the high altar had been placed the coronation regalia, whose central piece is the crown of St. Edward, placed upon the head of the sovereign at the actual ceremony of crowning. With becoming...
Poor people. So this is West Texas. I'm about, and it's completely washed. Two vehicles right up to the side, and it's pushed.
US and Russia are dangerously close to an armed conflict. This year, 2023, New Delhi will be the capital of global diplomacy. For a country as diverse as ours, with 88% of the population illiterate, it was a very big deal to write a constitution, and that too, the world's largest. Meanwhile, if we may, here's a Republic Day gift from India for the BBC. A list of suggestions for the BBC for their upcoming documentaries. Number 1, the Kohinoor and the colonial loot. Number 2, an outdated monarchy and unhealthy obsession with the royals. Number 3, racism in 2023. We're waiting.